right, so up until this point, our applications have had only one form. So let's consider what it might look like to create an application that has multiple forms. And I think the thing to do is to look at Visual Studio, and I have created an application here, a multiple form applications demo. And I'm going to, before I add anything, I'm just going to look at what the code looks like so far. And you'll see that there is a class here called form1, which derives from form. So form is something in the .NET framework, and our custom form derives from that. But in any case, the point is that a form is represented in our code as a class. So if we want a second form, what we will do is create a second class. So let's go back to design, and to this application we will add a button, give us something to work with, and we'll go into the event procedure for button by double-clicking. And what we want to do is we want to create a new form object. So form, let's say F for form equals new form. So it's really as simple as that. That creates the form object itself. It's a matter for us to put the appropriate data on it. So we'll do something simple. We'll just say F dot show. Just like we did messagebox.show, we can do show with, in fact, any form. So we'll run this code and click on button, and that creates a new form. Of course, this form doesn't have anything on it. It's like the original form that we were presented with when we created the Windows application. So rather than just creating the most generic form possible, which would of course be form as we've done here, let's instead add to our project. So in our project, we'll right-click and select Add, and I can say New Item or New Class or Windows Form. It'll all end up the same place. And I'm going to select Windows Form here, and I'm going to go ahead and have it be called Form 2, and click Add. And there you see the same sort of form that we saw before when we first created our application. And let's take a look at the code. And again, the code looks exactly as the code for Form 1 did. The difference, of course, is this is a separate class. It also derives or inherits from the System Windows Form class called Form, but the difference is we can now add additional stuff to this form. So for example, if I put a button on it, or if I put a checkbox, or any of the other controls that we've talked about, we can populate that form and it becomes distinct. So if I go back to my Form 1 code, instead of just saying new form, what I can do is I can say new form 2. And I don't even have to put the appropriate name here. There's still going to be a show event. So you can use the base class form for the class associated with your reference variable, or you can use the actual form name. In our case, it's not going to really make any difference. And now when you do a show, you're not doing a show of a generic blank form. You're actually doing a show of the form we just created. So I click Start, and there's my event procedure, and I click button 1, and sure enough, that's the new form that I just created. And if I go back to Form 1 and click this again, I get, in fact, another copy of that form. And if I do it again, I get a third copy. So I can do this as much as I want. And these are all separate instantiations of the class Form 2. I'll go ahead and close. I close that form directly. If I close the main form, then the other two are automatically closed. So now let's consider the possibility that rather than doing a simple show, which allows you to create multiple forms and go back and forth between the main form and the new form, what if you wanted to show that dialog or show that form as a dialog box? So there's also a show dialog command, and let's go ahead and run the code at this point. And you click on the button, and that brings up the form. And if I try to go back to the first form, it doesn't work. It won't allow me to do that. I have to somehow deal with this dialog box before I go back to the original form. And in fact, that is the difference between show and show dialog. Show dialog does not allow you to go back to the original form. So I'm going to have to somehow dismiss this. Okay, so I'm going to stop the application at this point and then come back here and say, all right, what are we going to do with the fact that we did a show dialog? And typically what you're going to want to do is look at some data on that form to help you determine what to do. Now, if you just bring up the form and look at all the possibilities of things that are available, of course, these are all more or less generic. They come from the form class themselves, and they're not going to help you with your situation. So what you need to do is you need to go to the form in question, which in this case will be treated as a dialog box. And for example, since checkbox is what I have here, what I want to do is to create a public property such that Form 1 can access that from an instance of Form 2. So I'm going to go into the code, and I will add a public property, and I'll make it a bool, and I'll say is checked. The idea being is what this is going to tell us is whether or not the check mark was actually checked. And this is a property, and so what I want to do is I want to do a get, and I want to return the name of the checkbox was checkbox1 dot checked. The value that it returns is whether or not the checkbox was checked. So I'm just basically going to be able to return that directly. I don't need a set, so let's clean this up. So now that we have our custom property in place, let's go ahead and go back to the code for Form 1. And when we're doing this show dialog, right after it, all we want to do is take a look at f dot is checked. And so that will be the property that's visible after the show dialog that's associated with form F. So of course I'm going to want to check that value, and so I think what I will do is I'll put out a message box, show, and if that's checked, I'll use a conditional operator here. The user checked the check box. Okay, and otherwise not checked. All right. And so depending on the value of that property out of that form, there'll be a different message box result. So we run the code and click on the button, and that brings up the form. Now it says Form 2, but this is actually behaving as if it were a dialog box. And I'm going to click on the checkbox and then close this form and or dialog box. And the message box we have here is the user checked the checkbox. In other words, it's behaving just as we would hope. If, on the other hand, I execute the form and don't check the checkbox, but just close the form, it says not checked. So in other words, it's doing exactly what a dialog box would do. So let's close this and make a couple of slight modifications to make this thing look a little bit more like a dialog box. So the first thing I'm going to do is to go to the form itself and go to its properties. And what I'm looking for here is control box. And if you select that, you will see that what this says is determines whether a form has a control system menu box. And I'm going to set that from true to false. And now if you look at the form, it looks a little bit more like a dialog box because these controls aren't here. The issue, of course, is that now I can't close the form, but that's kind of what the button is for. So let's look at the event procedure associated with this button. And it's here, and what I can do is I can say when this button is clicked, I want to close the form. If it makes more sense, what you're doing is you're calling a method here, so this.close. They do exactly the same thing. Visual Studio would consider this to be redundant because it's not necessary, but sometimes it's kind of instructive. What you're doing is you're closing the current form, which is to say you're closing the dialog box, so control goes back to the main form. So if I run the code and click on button 1 to get the dialog box to appear, there's my dialog box, and now it doesn't have the controls up here, and I can check my check button and then click on the button. That causes the form to close, and then I get my message box saying the user checked the checkbox. All right, so at that point you have something that looks pretty much like a dialog box, there's one other change you could make. It will work as it is, but there's one thing you could consider. I've made this property public, and it's a pretty harmless thing to do, but you might consider making this only available to the other classes in the same project, so it's not truly public. And there's a keyword for that, and that keyword is internal. So you can think of internal as being, let's say, project public, but not outside of the project. So it's just a slight modification to public. Property is checked would be available to all the other classes in the project, but would not be available to any other classes that were connected to this project using a reference. All right, now let's consider a little bit about scoping issues. So we have our dialog box being shown. Let's go and revert that back to just a regular show. So now this is no longer acting as a dialog box, but just a show command. I'm going to comment out the message box here so we can see what the behavior looks like. Let's remind ourselves of that. I'll click Start. And there's my form, and I click on the button, and it brings up a copy of Form 2 with the various information. And I can go back to Form 1 because this is now a show and not a show dialog, and I can create as many copies of this thing as I want. So that may very well be exactly what we need. The problem with this, as the code stands right now, let me close it, is that because this was created as a local variable, f, I can only access the data inside of that form when I'm inside of the event procedure. But it may well be that there are other methods that could use that data. So in that case, rather than making your form f a local variable, you want to make it a field. So form2f works exactly the same way. So of course that means I need to change this line so it's now an assignment rather than an initialization, and this is no longer a local variable but a field, like so. And now when I run the code, it looks the same in terms of its behavior. I can create as many copies of that form as I want. The difference, however, is if there was some data associated with each of these forms, I can get at that data. Let me close this. I can get at that data from other methods because now f is a field rather than a variable. So which one of those you'll choose pretty much depends upon what you're trying to accomplish. If you need that data to persist for a while, you'll want to make your form reference a field. If you don't need that, you would prefer that it be disposed of, then you would make your form reference a local variable. So that choice is depending upon your application. Okay, so that's multi-form applications. And the takeaways here are that you can create your own form class, just as the first form class was created for us. And you can populate that with whatever you might like to have in it. To show a copy of that form, you use f.show or the form method show. If you'd like to show as a dialog, you use show dialog. And depending upon how long you want the data to persist, your reference variable would either be a local variable or a field. Okay, so that's multi-form applications.